what are the types of regulations that are either in the pipeline or you've heard talked about that you worry about?
I don't worry about them, honestly. I think Bitcoin gives a high degree of optionality to the individual.
Yeah.
So if you're not being treated right in a certain jurisdiction, you can move yourself and your capital.
Yeah, one of my favorite kind of ideas about that is that because if you kept your Bitcoin, codes in your head, you can walk across any border anywhere
That's
and
right.
be as wealthy as you were in whatever country. That's kind of a wonderful thought experiment.
It's beautiful. The custodied properly, right? Bitcoin's the most unseizable property we've ever had. And we've had this ideal that I've written about, the inviolable property they've been writing about since at least the year 1215. It's in the Magna Carta, right? Governments were aiming at this, or at least the constitutional documents of governments were aiming at this concept that we couldn't make a technological reality, but we were trying to make a socio-cultural reality, right? Like, let's just agree to all have really strong property. Now, the reality of that situation is people are people, right? If they can do a thing, they'll do a thing.
Right,
So
right.
we needed to create something like Bitcoin that could actually instantiate that. But I will mention one regulation I think is just stupid that I hear talked about is this idea of taxing unrealized capital gains.
Right.
So basically, you buy a thing, it goes up in nominal price, and you haven't sold the thing, so you haven't realized any gain at all. They want to tax that unrealized gain. Now, if you think about this, combining that tax on unrealized gains with inflation it's accelerated confiscation because they're just printing money, pumping your house price.
Right.
You now owe me money on that depreciated nominal value increase. So it's
I know every time I try to spend my unrealized gains, like nobody will talk to me. So it's like it seems bad on the other side. A lot of your work, or you mention in a lot of your interviews and a lot of your writing and podcasts, The Sovereign Individual, which is a book that came out in the late 90s, which is pretty fascinating. Can you summarize it and talk about why it's so important to your kind of larger worldview?
Yeah, it's quite the rabbit hole, but written in 1997, it made a number of prescient predictions that have come true. Social media, anonymous digital cyber cash, the use of a pandemic to reinforce the validity of nation-state borders and control. And I guess the thesis of the book, Mark Andreessen has this now very popular phrase, software is eating the world, which I think he said 10 or 15 years ago, also proved to be very prescient. Yeah. Well, that is very true. And I think you could expand that to say software is also eating the state, right?
Right.
The technological realities we inhabit determine our political realities. So in a way, society comes to reflect the technologies which dominate its day. And so in the large-scale industrial age, we had large-scale nation states.
Right.
Well, now the world's very different, right? Most of our attention is being channeled through digital devices. The microprocessors, they call them in the book, what I just call digital technology, has proven to be disruptive across the board. I don't think there's a business in the world now that's not been affected by digital. So I think Bitcoin is just an extension of that thesis, that software is eating even our most fundamental organizational realities, like our nation state, right? We identify, it's part of our identity to say, I'm American, I'm this, I'm that. But all of these things are now called into question in this new technological reality.
Yeah, and that book is particularly interesting to think about it, after the Cold War ends and, maybe there's a 500-year kind of push towards more and more centralized control, centralized identities, things like that, culminates maybe in the Soviet Union, which then disappears. And there's this relaxing and people spread out, globalization. People start talking about individualism again rather than collectivism. Right. Do you think that's still on, and it's all enabled by technology, by the internet and then the web laid on top of that and all of the devices you're talking about. And that was written 10 years before the smartphone came out, which then accelerates the ability of people to have something like peer-to-peer communication. Do you feel like that's still proceeding apace? Because a lot of people talk about how, in the West, broadly speaking, since then we had the global war on terror, where the state kind of reasserted itself and surveillance powers. You look at something like China right now, where they're building out or trying to build out a kind of social credit system where the government has massive amounts of data and they're sifting through it and predicting, how people are going to act and punishing or rewarding for them. Are we still in an era where the individual is sovereign, or what are the challenges to that?
Well, ultimately, I think through the scope of natural law, the individual is always sovereign because you always have a choice. Right. Now, you can be tortured and robbed of your power and manipulated and coerced and all these things, but there's always a choice. There's, the great book on this is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. There's a final human freedom, right? We all get to choose how to respond, no matter what the situation is.
And this is Camus saying, suicide is always an option. So
there you go.
I mean, that's kind of like you only get to do that once, but you've got that.
You get one exit option. I do think we're moving closer to the sovereign individual thesis in the long run, but the middle game is very uncertain. And so China has done a great job of perfecting this digital dystopia that you've described. And I think what's happening now is that model, China tends to lead the rest of the world technologically. That model is being exported into the West. And I think COVID was basically step one of that, right? It's like the business model of statism that faces disruption by things like Bitcoin and adjacent technologies is now going to fight for its own survival. So that mid game is very uncertain to me. And I think those that make themselves expensive to tyranny will be the ones that ultimately emerge wealthy, healthy, and to rebuild the decentralized world of the future.